3 scholars, 3 resignations, 1 note left behind. This is not a text to be read. It is a text that reads you. Somewhere in Western Europe, there is a manuscript that has never been fully translated. Not because it can't be, because everyone who tried stopped. No breakdown, no crisis. They just stopped and walked away, calm, unnervingly calm. The man behind it has no birth record, no death record, no portrait, just a name that keeps appearing, always at the edges of history, always in the margins. Dorian Calden. For 5 centuries, his central idea has been doing something that should be impossible. It's been disappearing, not destroyed, not banned, simply withdrawn, as if the knowledge itself decided it no longer wanted to be found. I spent 2 years tracing it, through Renaissance Florence, through Jung's private letters, through archives that weren't supposed to exist. What I found wasn't mysticism, it was a mechanism, a precise sequence of interior events that occurs when a human mind contacts a specific kind of knowledge, and a warning about what happens when you're not ready. The final fragment says only this: what you are looking for is not in the text. Look at what happened to you while you were reading. 3 scholars read that line. 3 scholars stopped. What did they understand in that moment? That answer changes everything. Keep watching. Somewhere in Western Europe, there is a private archive. Inside it, a manuscript that has never been fully translated, not because no one tried, because everyone who tried stopped. The year is 2009. A professor of Renaissance philosophy at one of Germany's most respected universities clears his desk. No announcement, no farewell lecture. He submits his resignation, leaves 1 handwritten note, and disappears from academic life entirely. The note contains a single sentence. This is not a text to be read. It is a text that reads you. His colleagues assumed burnout, a breakdown perhaps. But this was the 3rd scholar to walk away from the same project. 3 different researchers, 3 different decades. The same result. I've spent the better part of 2 years trying to understand why. The manuscript is attributed to a figure known only as Dorian Calden. No birth record confirms his existence. No death record closes his biography. And yet, his name keeps appearing. Always at the edges, always in the margins. A reference buried in Marsilio Ficino's unpublished letters from the 1460s. A footnote in Manly P. Hall's private research notes. A single oblique mention in a lesser-known Carl Jung lecture from 1935. At the time, each of these references seemed like a minor curiosity. Later, I would understand they were coordinates, pointing to the same location from different directions. Here is the question that stopped me cold when I first encountered this case. It wasn't who Dorian Calden was, it was something stranger. Why does everything connected to his name keep vanishing? Not destroyed, not banned, not burned, simply withdrawn. As if the knowledge itself decided it no longer wanted to be found. The Hermetic tradition, the philosophical current running from ancient Egypt through Renaissance Florence into the work of Jung, has a name for this phenomenon. They called it self-suppression. The idea that certain forms of knowledge don't require an enemy to disappear. They collapse under their own weight, like stars whose gravity finally exceeds the force of their own light. I want you to hold that image, a star collapsing inward, not destroyed by something outside, destroyed by what it contained. Because that image, I would later discover, is precisely what Calden was writing about. When I finally located the first surviving fragment of his work, cross-referenced across Ficino's correspondence, and 2 separate archival sources in Florence. I expected mysticism, vague spiritual poetry, the kind of text that sounds profound and means nothing. What I found was different. It read like a warning, precise, architectural, cold. Calden wasn't describing a spiritual practice. He was describing a mechanism, a specific sequence of interior events that occurs when a human mind comes into direct contact with a particular kind of knowledge. And he was describing, in careful detail, what goes wrong. The manuscript's central claim, reconstructed from those scattered fragments, is not mystical in any comfortable sense. It states that this knowledge cannot be stored in an unchanged person, that the information is not inert. It is a solvent, and most people who encounter it are not prepared to be dissolved. The professor in Germany knew this. That's why he left. The question is what he found inside that text that made walking away feel like the only safe option. To answer that, we need to go back to Florence, 1463, to the moment when a philosopher named Ficino received an order that would change the course of Western thought, and to the shadow that moved alongside that moment, a shadow with no name yet, but we would come to call it Calden. In 1463, a dying man summoned a philosopher to his bedside. The man was Cosimo de Medici, the wealthiest person in Europe, and his final request wasn't for a priest. It was for a translation. Cosimo had spent decades collecting ancient manuscripts, not as decoration, as intelligence. He believed, with absolute conviction, that buried inside certain ancient texts was a form of knowledge, that the modern world had lost, not lost by accident, lost by design. When a complete copy of the Corpus Hermeticum arrived in Florence, smuggled out of Macedonia by a monk named Leonardo da Pistoia, Cosimo made an immediate decision. He stopped every other project Ficino was working on, including the translation of Plato, the most celebrated philosopher in Western history, set aside indefinitely. The Hermetic texts came first. Ask yourself, what could possibly be more urgent than Plato to a dying Renaissance prince? Marsilio Ficino was 30 years old. He completed the translation in months, an almost impossible pace for texts this dense. What he produced wasn't just scholarship. Ficino understood something his contemporaries missed entirely. The world was dividing. On one side, the medieval cosmos, every object saturated with meaning, every event connected to something larger than itself. On the other, the emerging rationalist order, the universe as a machine, matter without interiority, reality stripped of any inside. Ficino saw exactly where this was heading. Once the interior dimension of reality was surrendered to the mechanical account, it would be gone. Not suppressed. Not waiting somewhere to be rediscovered. Gone. In a manner so total that future generations wouldn't even have the vocabulary to mourn it. That loss, the one Ficino feared in 1463, I would later discover is precisely what Calden spent his life trying to prevent, and precisely what is happening right now. It was inside Ficino's working notes, not the published translation, the private notes, that the name first appears. A marginal annotation, written in a different hand. 3 words in Latin, followed by a name. Calden legit aliter. Calden reads it differently. Not a critique, not a correction, a warning. Whoever wrote that annotation knew Ficino's translation was accurate, and still felt the need to flag that someone else understood the text in a way that went further, deeper, into territory Ficino himself hadn't entered. Who was in that room? Who had access to Ficino's private working notes? And why does their name appear nowhere else in the historical record? Here is what the Corpus Hermeticum actually describes, and why it matters. The opening tractate, known as the Poimandres, begins with Hermes in a state between sleep and waking. A being identifies itself as Nous, pure mind, and proceeds to reveal the structure of reality. But not from outside, from within Hermes himself. This is the detail most commentators skip over. The knowledge doesn't descend from above. It surfaces from the deepest interior of the person receiving it. Calden, according to the fragments that survive, insisted on this with what his interpreters described as violent emphasis. The knowledge is not about consciousness. The knowledge is a mode of consciousness. To read it without undergoing the corresponding interior change is to mistake the map for the territory, and then wonder why the map doesn't bleed. Ficino published his translation in 1471. It spread across Europe within decades, copied, studied, debated. But the marginal annotation, Calden legit a liter, never appeared in any published version. It was removed. By whom, we don't know. What we do know is this. Buried inside the fragments that survived, Calden described a specific sequence of interior transformation. 3 stages. He called the third one the dissolution that dissolves dissolution itself. Every scholar who has tried to fully document what that means has eventually stopped. The German professor was not the first. He won't be the last. In Part 3, we go inside those 3 stages, and we find out exactly what Calden warned would happen to anyone who enters them unprepared. Every tradition that ever took human transformation seriously arrived at the same map. Different names, different centuries, different cultures, the same 3 stages, and the same warning about what happens if you stop halfway. The alchemists called the first stage nigredo, the blackening, not depression, something more precise. The moment the organized fiction of the self begins to lose coherence. The structure cracks, and what leaks through isn't evil. It's unlived life. Everything a person amputated in order to function. Carl Jung documented this in Psychology and Alchemy, 1944. He wasn't writing metaphor. He was reporting clinical observations, watching people break down, and occasionally reconstitute into something they hadn't been before. The second stage is albedo, the whitening. This is where it gets dangerous, because albedo arrives with light. After the collapse, something opens, a luminous, expansive sense of understanding, the feeling that you finally see clearly. Most people stop here. They think they've arrived. They haven't. Calden called this the most predictable failure in the entire tradition. The alchemists named it the silver trap. Not because silver is base, because silver is beautiful, luminous, almost sufficient. The silver trap doesn't catch weak people. It catches serious ones. The further you've traveled, the more convincing the stopping point looks. The third stage is rubedo, the reddening. Red, in alchemical symbolism, is the color of blood, full embodiment. The emerald tablet, dating to at least the 8th century, describes the entire work in one line. That which is above is as that which is below. Not astrology. A description of a specific interior state, when the distinction between the knowledge and the knower stops generating friction. Not because the question has been answered, because the need for a definitive answer has been recognized as itself a symptom. Here is what Calden understood, and what the 3 scholars eventually confronted. The third dissolution doesn't dissolve the self. It dissolves the self's misunderstanding of itself. That sounds manageable. It is not. From the inside, It is indistinguishable from annihilation. Jung described it in a private letter to Erich Neumann, 1952. He called it Weltuntergang, the end of the world, not outside, inside. Every assumption, every framework, every hard-won certainty, gone. No guarantee of what comes next. The German professor reached this point inside Calden's manuscript. So did the two before him. What did they find there that made stopping feel safer than continuing? Part 4 has the answer, and it will reframe everything we've covered so far. 3 scholars, 3 decades, 3 resignations, the same manuscript, the same stopping point. I need to ask you something before we go further. Think about the last time you genuinely changed your mind about something fundamental. Not updated a preference, not shifted an opinion, fundamentally changed, in a way that made the previous version of you unrecognizable. If that's ever happened to you, type dissolved in the comments right now. If it hasn't, type intact. I'll explain why that distinction matters more than you think. By the end of this part, you may want to change your answer. Let's return to the silver trap. Because understanding it requires honesty, most people prefer to avoid. Eliphas Lévy, the 19th century French occultist whose work shaped every serious esoteric movement that followed, documented a pattern he observed repeatedly. A practitioner achieves a genuine breakthrough, real dissolution, real opening. Something irreversible shifts inside them. And then, almost immediately, they begin building a structure around the experience, a system, a language, an identity. The person who went through the fire becomes their defining characteristic. Here is the problem. The moment you construct an identity around a transformative experience, you have stopped transforming. You have taken the most alive moment of your interior life and turned it into a monument. Monuments don't move. Look at the modern spiritual landscape and you'll see the silver trap everywhere. The meditation teacher who had one profound experience in 2009 and has been explaining it ever since. The breathwork facilitator whose entire personality is organized around a single weekend retreat. The philosopher who glimpsed genuine dissolution and immediately wrote a book about it. Calden apparently described this with cold precision 5 centuries before it became a global industry. He called it mistaking moonlight for the sun, close enough to be convincing. Not even remotely the same thing. And here, right here, is the detail that will matter in the final part. The civilization that is losing Calden's knowledge isn't losing it to ignorance. It's losing it to the preference for moonlight, for the luminous arrest of albedo, for transformation without dissolution. When I cross-referenced the 3 scholars who abandoned the Calden manuscript, a pattern emerged that I didn't expect. None of them had a breakdown. None of them became unstable or erratic. They became calm. Unusually, almost unnervingly calm. The German professor, in the weeks before his resignation, was described by colleagues as suddenly, inexplicably at peace. One colleague recalled, he stopped arguing. About anything. For an academic, that is not a small detail. I've spent months trying to understand what that calm means. Whether it was the calm of someone who found an answer, or the calm of someone who understood, with complete clarity, that they were standing at a threshold they could not safely cross. Here is what Calden's 3rd dissolution actually demands. Not the dissolution of your failures, not your shadow, your trauma, your difficult past. Those are the easy things to surrender. The 3rd dissolution asks for the dissolution of your certainties, your frameworks, your most trusted ways of making sense of reality. The very cognitive architecture you use to evaluate whether something is true. Paracelsus, the 16th century physician who transformed European medicine, wrote with a doctor's directness, "The medicine that cannot harm is not potent enough to heal." The Calden material carries this quality at every stage. It is not designed to comfort. It is designed to work. And working means altering the container, not just the contents. The German professor's note said, "This is not a text to be read. It is a text that reads you." I've been treating that as a metaphor. I was wrong. In the final surviving fragment of the Calden manuscript, located in a footnote so obscure it took 14 months to trace, there is a single instruction to the reader. It doesn't explain the third dissolution. It doesn't warn against it. It says only this: what you are looking for is not in the text. It never was. Look at what happened to you while you were reading. 3 scholars read that line. 3 scholars stopped. In Part 5, we find out what they understood in that moment, and why the disappearance of this knowledge may not be a tragedy at all. We started with a professor who walked away. A single sentence on a piece of paper. I told you at the beginning that sentence seemed like a description of power, a text dominating its reader. I was wrong about that too. Let me tell you what I think those 3 scholars actually found. Not a breakdown, not a revelation in any comfortable sense, something quieter, more unsettling. They found that the manuscript was working on them, not through its content, but through the act of sustained attention itself. Every genuine question the text raised pulled the reader into the question, not as an observer, as the material being examined. Think about that for a moment. When was the last time something you read didn't give you information, but changed the instrument you use? To process information? That's a different category of experience entirely. Here is what the Calden case actually reveals. The knowledge didn't disappear because it was suppressed. It didn't disappear because civilization became too distracted or too shallow. It disappeared because it cannot survive being merely known. Information about transformation is not the same as transformation. A map of fire is not heat. You can digitize every surviving Hermetic manuscript, translate them, index them, make them freely available to anyone with an internet connection, and lose them completely in the process. Ficino understood this in 1463. That's why the translation felt like a rescue operation. Not preservation, rescue. Because the moment this knowledge becomes content, it becomes something else entirely. So, the disappearance. Is it a loss? Yes. And also, no. The Hermetic tradition has always insisted on one thing above everything else. The knowledge withdraws to exactly the depth the seeker is willing to descend. It doesn't abandon anyone. It waits, patient as lead, quiet as a frozen river with a current underneath. Calden, whoever he was, seems to have understood that his work would not survive. In the conventional sense, he appears to have written it that way deliberately. A text designed not to be preserved, designed to be undergone, which raises the most uncomfortable question of this entire investigation. What if the 3 scholars who walked away weren't failures? What if stopping, at precisely that moment, was the most honest response available to them? Now, I want you to do something. Go back. Rewatch the moment in Part 1, where I first read the professor's note. This is not a text to be read. It is a text that reads you. Ask yourself, not what it means intellectually. Ask yourself what happened inside you when you first heard it. Because that reaction, whatever it was, is data. It's the most accurate information you have about where you currently stand in relation to this material. Write it in the comments. One sentence. What happened inside you when you heard that line for the first time? I read every one. Dorian Calden left no biography, no portrait, no grave, only a question, hidden inside a manuscript that 3 serious scholars decided was safer left unfinished. The knowledge doesn't disappear. It withdraws to precisely the depth you are willing to go, and it waits there, patient as lead, luminous as the gold it always already was.